you have also been working on other works, other treatises by Maitreya and Mipam's commentaries. So when you look at the Uttaratantra, the ultimate continuum, in the context of the overall works of Maitreya, what is your take on the position of Uttaratantra in relation to other works of Maitreya, and also, of course, other sutras and tantras? One of the things we have discussed in the past sessions is also the term tantra itself in the name of Uttaratantra, although it's not considered as an esoteric Vajrayana text. So
Yes.
if you can share some light on that.
Well, yes, Mipam makes some quite interesting comments on that in his analysis of the title by saying that, you know, the Tantra basically means the kind of continuity or the thread that's running through. But he also makes a sort of reference to the fact that it is like a Tantra in the textual sense. In I can't remember exactly what he says, but he's talking about, you know, the three aspects of the, you know, the ground and the path and the fruit, and you know, some of the sort of concepts that are particularly characteristic of tantras as a genre. So he certainly makes that connection as a you know, as a possibility, but you know, we'll never really know, of course, what the original intention was. But there's a lot to say just about the title itself, and the whole idea of you know, what is meant by lama as well. You know, by uttara. Is it something that just comes later? Is it something that is somehow sort of sublime and above everything else? There's, you know, it's there's a lot to tease out in even in the title. But to go back to what you're asking about, the sort of connection between the 5 texts of Maitreya, I think very interesting, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the authorship as well, because that's something that has fascinated me. But in terms of the connection between the 3, of course, the you know, the traditional Tibetan view on it, at least for some scholars, is that the 5 texts are indeed connected, and I believe that it's said that the Abhisamaya Alankara, the Nguntok has a introduction, has a lengchi.
Yes.
And
then,
yes, and then the Gyur Lama has a colophon. So and the other 3 don't. And the theory is that, you know, in a sense, Asanga received first the Abhisamaya Alankara, and then the Dodegyen, the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, and then the 2 Vibhangas, I can't remember in which order, and then the Gyur Lama as a kind of set, and that the whole intention of the 5 texts together was in some sense an explanation of what is meant by the Prajnaparamita teachings. And I find that an extremely interesting idea. And of course that ties back to the whole legend of the story of how Asanga received them from Maitreya. But it's a Tibetan view, really, isn't it? And if you go to the Chinese scholars and what they believe about the origins of these texts, you get a completely different picture. And they don't believe that the Uttaratantra was even written by Asanga at all. And they have a completely different, you know, history of its authorship. So I think it's very interesting to take the 5 texts together, despite their rather mysterious interconnections, you know, over history, because we have this fascinating thing that the Dhammadhammadhatu Vibhanga and the Uttaratantra were apparently lost or apparently disappeared for quite a few centuries in India, although we know that they existed in earlier times because of the Chinese translation. And then, of course, the two texts were sort of rediscovered, apparently according to the traditional account by Maitreya. And so, you know, does that indicate that somehow they weren't really of the same authorship, and this is some kind of a later concoction that the Tibetans made? I don't believe that, but that's what some people say. You know, I tend to. It's funny, isn't it? This is a little bit the same with people's allegiances to a particular Tibetan lineage, and it's the same really across the wider picture. Whether you brought up as a in the Chinese Buddhist tradition or the Theravada tradition or the Tibetan tradition, you tend to stick with what you started with, isn't it? And you have a strong disinclination to change streams.
So,
And I find it funny that really that many of us, you know, if we started off studying as the Gelugpa tradition or the Sakyapa tradition or the Nyingma tradition or the Kajupa tradition, it's kind of that's what you stick to. You know, there aren't many people who change over because they're convinced by the arguments of one of the other lineages, and yet somehow, you know, we of course all feel that the lineage we are studying with must somehow be, at least for us, must be the best. You know, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it, would we? But you know, at the same time, other people are equally convinced that what they're studying and what they receive and how they see things is the best. And so I find that fascinating, because are we, you know, what takes preponderance? Are we rational beings who take things entirely on the validity of the arguments, or are we more convinced by the people we meet and the impact they have on us and the allegiance we feel to, you know, to individual teachers or fellow practitioners or whatever it might be? Do you see what I mean? And I would say that the latter probably colors our views more than we imagine in some, you know, in some way. So
yeah. I
yeah.
think that's a very precious insight and wisdom from you, because I think that is one of the main weaknesses of people who are following spiritual traditions, particularly spiritual traditions, because probably secular people are more open-minded, although they can be very fanatical about secularism.
Indeed, yes.
But even within the Tibetan tradition, though, I want to throw this to you and get your take on it. So when you look at the structure, it is quite convincing to think that these 5 works actually are parts of one sort of single work, because you have one work with the beginning, the supplication and so forth, and then one work, the Uttaratantra, with the dedication and colophons, and the others sort of don't have either of these and fit in the middle. But then you have also Tibetan scholars, including Mipham himself, arguing that these different texts actually talk about different points belonging to different schools of thought in Mahayana Buddhism. So they couldn't possibly be coherently put as one single work, unless that single work is presenting a diversity of philosophical thought. So some texts considered to be Chittamatra or mind only in terms of philosophical position. I mean, even to take, for instance, the first text, the Ornament of Realization, which is talking more about the perfection of wisdom and emptiness, and the last text that we are talking about, counter-arguing that and saying there is a true real thing called Buddha nature. So even Tibetans don't necessarily always agree that they are all composed by one person as a single unit, I think. No? What's your take on that?
Well, I think, you know, one has to be quite broad-minded, and those classifications of texts like these to a particular drupta, you know, point of view, if if they were really sort of indisputable, then there wouldn't be arguments about it. But I don't think it's as easy as that. You know, one can point to certain factors in each of the texts that might position them, you know, in one or the other school. But I don't think it's, you know, it's interesting, but I don't think it's ultimately convincing. And to be honest, you know, there's this whole very, very interesting idea. Of course, Mipam ends up saying that he thinks that the correct view is that both the second and third turning teachings are definitive. And so in one way, the arguments of the Prajnaparamita about emptiness and the arguments of the Gyulama about you know, the existence of the Buddha nature are not kind of obviously not really contradictory. You know, they're two sides of two ways of looking at the same thing, and complement each other. But I mean, I think, you know, the Prajnaparamita as a whole is certainly, although it's kind of very loosely classified as being all about emptiness, it's not really, is it? It goes far further than that. It has a huge range of different topics and ways of understanding that really the Abhisamalankara in particular brought out. Because here you know, you have, if you like, the original sort of Prajnaparamita interpretations of Nagarjuna, very much, you know, going along Madhyamika lines about how, you know, there is no you know, no sort of definitive existence for anything really, but Asanga really, in a way, as the founder of the sort of vast tradition, luckily, I think, gave us a much wider perspective, a much vaster perspective on Nagarjuna's deep insights, if you like, and brought in a whole range of practices and approaches and stages and all the rest of it that you wouldn't really find and would be a little bit unapproachable if you studied entirely from the sort of Nagarjuna viewpoint, isn't it? And I'm very interested because I've been delving deeply into, well, deeply, I think it would take a lifetime to do that, but I've been looking more than I ever had before into the Prajnaparamita texts recently, because I've been editing a translation of the Nitri, the Prajnaparamita in 25,000 lines, which we are going to be publishing in 84,000 in probably take quite a few more months, but it's kind of approaching readiness. And really the range of topics and so forth that one could find in the long Prajnaparamita sutras, let alone, of course, the whole range of Prajnaparamita literature is extraordinary. So, you know, I think to sort of step back and look at them schematically is very interesting, but down at the level of, at the more granular level of the detail of what they're all about is gives a very different picture. And really the Abhisamalankara in particular pointed to that, didn't it? It pointed to the sort of implicit teachings in the Prajnaparamita about the different stages, the different paths, the different ways that they can be seen, and you know, that I think gives a very different perspective.
Well, that's wonderful. And I think you are such a great advocate and exponent of what Mipham would have liked to convey regarding Buddha nature, not trying to actually synergizing the second and the third turning of the wheel, sort of coalescing the empty and luminous nature of the mind. This is really very clear and convincing, but a lot of the other scholars do the the opposite, no? Especially scholars in Sakya and Gelug traditions, instead of seeing something more sort of substantive and finding something in the Prajnaparamita, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras about luminosity of Buddha nature, they would instead interpret the third turning or even this text, the ultimate continuum, and understand Gotra as simply emptiness. So,
Yes, yes. Yes,
anyway,
well, yeah.
Please go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say we had a very interesting teaching a few weeks ago from Khenpo Pema Sherab, who was telling us, and again, I don't remember, I didn't really even take in the full details, but he was suggesting that people, again, sort of so strongly dedicated to the views of their own lineage. Sometimes he was telling us about a copy of the, I don't even know which Prajnaparamita Sutra, maybe the Nitri, that belonged to the library in Zamtang, which they sort of kept as evidence, if you like, of skullduggery, because there was a manuscript where somebody at some point in history, and I have no idea who's responsible or when it happened, had actually crossed out a reference to luminosity and substituted, Tongpanyi. So, there was a sort of feeling that the texts they ought to say something that they didn't actually say. You know what I mean? So, I am all for a sort of global synthetic view of what the teachings are about and how they're not of course the whole idea of distinguishing between what's definitive and what's provisional is an extremely important approach. We'd be lost without having those perspectives, but if you divide it into compartments that are too completely watertight, and really what some people seem to be saying is that if there's a provisional teaching, you don't even need to take any notice of it. You know what I mean? And of course, the idea of a provisional teaching is that it's something that's actually really helpful and is important for somebody to take really seriously at some stage on their path. And if we sort of dismiss anything that's provisional as sort of lightweight and inconsequential, then that's kind of missing the point. And maybe there isn't quite such a hard and fast line that you can always draw between provisional and definitive. After all, if the real nature of everything is so inexpressible and ineffable and impossible to grasp intellectually, then how can we really talk about any teaching being definitive? You know what I mean? Everything is provisional, surely. So it would be nice to, in a way, sort of dissolve some of those watertight compartments. But I must say, I was very inspired by, the approach of my teachers, and I'm particularly thinking of Denghu Khyentse Rinpoche, who, whenever he gave a teaching on whatever topic it was, he would weave in all sorts of notions and ideas and quotes from really all of the teachings at all levels, all the vehicles and all of the traditions, and sort of somehow see it all as a kind of network of perspectives that all had their value, and that seems to me to be a very positive approach to Buddhist literature as a whole, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this inclusive approach that we find particularly among the Rime masters, I think is so important. And when you shared this story from Khenpo Pema Sherab about somebody changing the words of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, I as a young monk was also told about a certain Lama, I will name the Lama, editing the Lhasa Kanjur, sort of inserting phrases to align the reading of the Kanjur with the interpretation of his particular school. But I think that kind of risk is faced also by modern translators. As we translate into a different language, as we discussed earlier, if we choose a specific term like potential for Gotra, it already sort of creates that bias that the person who will read the text will obviously get that particular understanding and not a very inclusive one. So it's very important, I think, for translators to remain as neutral and as inclusive as possible.